Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. Joining me on today's podcast is Dor Raviv, CTO of Orca AI. Orca AI redefines ship navigation through artificial intelligence, collective learning, sensor function, and proprietary hardware, all of these in order to provide a holistic solution for the future of shipping and autonomous vessels. Dor, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Christopher. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure you're busy as a CTO of a technology company. So let's talk a little bit about about Orca AI. You guys have been in the news recently, not only from your products but a relatively recent fundraise, and that's exciting stuff to hear that people are interested, about investing in our industry. Talk to us a little bit about what you're up to today there with the company.
So thanks, Christopher. Orca AI has been built since 2018, where we just started with the vision and idea on how to use basically the gradual process of adoption of computer vision algorithms in general availability, where these algorithms are getting more and more popularity, assisting in different industries such as the automotive industry, medical industry, and even other industries. And we actually identified a gap coming from the Israeli Navy. Both my co-founder and myself were good friends of 15 years, serving together in the Naval Academy. And we have identified a gap that computer vision and AI can actually truly assist in day-to-day operations of large commercial vessels, mainly due to the fact that these algorithms today are basically human equivalent in the ability to identify other targets, to generate context of what the surrounding is all about. And of course, working alongside other sensors on board, such as the ARPA and radar and the ECDIS, can truly gain situational awareness, and that's what we have built to date. I'm happy to say that the industry actually embraced us and welcomed us with open arms to trial and adopt this technology. And we actually released the product in 2021, and it has generated some really interesting adoption from some of the major shipping conglomerates of the world.
That's really interesting because one of the things that that I think, well, the name of the podcast is The Last Dinosaur, is we're a little slower to adopt, especially on technology, it seems. Although I think it was a little bit tongue in cheek, and even in the last year that I've been doing this podcast, that's the pace of change has picked up, significantly. I love, we've had a lot of different founder types or people who've been involved early days of companies, whether the company is John Vesson, who, started a company 20 years ago, to someone like yourself who started a company 2 years ago. Talk a little bit about the startup environment and working with the fund. You guys were, funded at one point or continue to be work with the doc. Talk to us a little bit about that. I think that's a really interesting angle, only because there's a lot of these startup incubators or accelerators in the industry. And I just want to know kind of your experience with that.
What I can say from my perspective, so the industry, as you mentioned, is quite too slow to adapt to new realities and changes, slower in comparison to other industries. And I think that moving slow, not only when the vessel moves slower, but also in the mindset, probably is the main cause for these companies to grow and become sustainable businesses who has sometimes the hundreds of years of old of, same types of operations, slow to adapt and change. Now, I have to say that from a startup point of view, it is required of us to be well funded, to be able to take the long walk with our clients and educate them about the technology and help them adopt it, and really working alongside them to prove them that the technology is valid, it's reliable, it's something that has impact on their day-to-day operations and safety, and it's tangible technology, not just something to show off, but it's something that truly can impact their business. And as for any, let's call it a B2B sale, we have to be able to listen carefully to the client's feedback, to adopt really, really quickly, to show progress, to take care of their concerns, to mitigate their concerns, and prove over and over again that the technology is reliable, that the crews use it and they love it. And it kind of requires you to be something of a little bit different animal than what you would might say a classical B2C SaaS kind of startup where you can just roll out on millions of users and A/B test them. The industry is not that, I would call it, doesn't have a lot of patience to growing and adapting products, especially in our domain, which is machine learning and deep learning, which is let's call it incrementally improving technology. And it's not something that one day just works. Takes time for these processes.
And I think what you pointed out was something that's really kind of very true. Sometimes you go into these companies and they say, well, we've been doing this way for 100 years, right? We've been running. I mean, I work for Vesson and both Vesson and then Q88 where I came from, and now we're one company. Both have a voyage management type software. Does a lot of the similar functions, some different. I won't get into it, but we still encounter people. I keep track of my fleet on a spreadsheet. And by the way, we've been doing this now. My grandfather started this fleet. How do you argue with that, right? So it does come from, I think, over time, people adopting technology, different mindsets kind of move up in the company and start to have this more adoptive technology. Certainly, having a great program out in Israel like you guys had with the dock is something that must have been really beneficial, not only from the money point of view, but bringing together other founders at the same time. That must have been a good experience as well, to compare ideas, or at least from the advisor point of view, them kind of helping you guys along.
Yeah, so regarding that, I can confirm that all of us startup founders in Maritime basically face the similar challenges in how to convince the clients and how to create the true economical benefit. One thing I hear the most out of our clients and users is that if it's not regulated, if I don't have to do it, convince me. And what is the best way to convince the clients to adopt new technology, especially one that you need to install on board hardware and put cameras on the compass deck, and it's a hassle, right? And you need to collect the data, and you need to open up the firewall. And what about cybersecurity? And how do we know that you keep all of our data intact? And is it shared? And is it related to GDPR? And a lot of things go into the mix of how to build a multidisciplinary solution like that. And we all face the same challenges, the requirement from us to build one true platform that takes care of all of it, because the industry is so well consolidated. You mentioned a voyage managing tool. I assume that it requires some sort of a data collection from somewhere, and you can discuss months just on what data and the formats and the protocols, and it's so long of a sale, let's call it, until everyone already lose their patience and go back to the old and familiar spreadsheets that worked for 100 years.
Yeah, and I think that you talk about one thing, because you said the word standards. I mean, just as a whole, you're kind of going a little off topic. I know one of the things, and this is more related to related to a lot of things, including emissions, is trying to get our head around, as an industry, a standard noon report. And I remember sailing. I was in the Navy. I sailed on merchant ships. Speed. Right. I remember filling out the noon report. I put something down, and the captain's like, well, I noticed you put like 12 and a half knots. I'm like, well, that's kind of what we're going. And he goes, yeah, but we're making turns for 13. I said, yeah, but we know we're going into this current. And Well, and then you get that just discussion of speed. Is it speed over ground, made speed? All these, you got like 3 or 4 different terms of speed that you could do. And you're talking about one, one row, one field of data, basically, right? You're not even talking about a record. You're talking about a field, and a row of that. So it's a really interesting discussion. Obviously you guys are on the forefront with AI. Certainly there's a lot of good, and what kind of good feedback have you heard so far with kind of the AI and the autonomous part? Because there's obviously a good, and then we'll certainly get to the bad, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about this, especially from the seafarer's point of view. What have you guys kind of experienced so far as you've rolled this out onto the ships?
So this is a really good question. We actually encounter two whole different perspectives on this technology. First, the old and traditional mariners, the captains of the world that grew up with paper charts and had a lot of questions of why do we need digital charts at all, and slow to adopt, but with some understanding that this generation is retiring and new generation of people are coming on board. Let's call them the Y generation people, my age, 35, 40, 30. So these people, they grew up with social media. We grew up with Uber and taxis and ordering food to our doorstep and buying online things. And this generation, basically today, this is, I would say, the generation that loves our technology the most. They are used to work with technology on their day-to-day lives, and they go on board and they operate like they operated in the last 40, 50, 60 years. Nothing much have changed other than more colors, better screens, more functionality of the same tools of the radar and actives. And there is one image I can't get rid of when we installed our system on one of our clients, and you can see all the young crew, they just take pictures of it with their iPhone 13X Max on
Yeah.
8K, and then they leave them to the port and they need to send a fax that they left the port. It's just
It's yeah.
dissonance.
It's crazy. Yeah, I think some of the retiring ages are older. I'm a Gen Xer, and which is interesting if you've been on social media. Gen Xers sit right in the middle of the wave that are retiring, and we're kind of, we didn't grow up with it, but I think I run a podcast and I do it all myself, so I can tell you technology isn't that familiar. I when I sailed, it was over 20 years ago, so I was paper charts and everything. If I was still selling, I think I would embrace this to say, okay, this looks like more like how my life is now. And you bring up a good point of how to attract younger people into shipping. And I think not necessarily the gamification of shipping, but certainly offering the technology, right? And these sort of platforms like yours that assist in collision and situational awareness definitely is a plus, and could be considered or attractive way of getting more folks into the industry.
And by the way, Christopher, this is exactly the feedback that we get. So when you ask me what is the feedback, so when we build the system, we had in mind the human operator. We are not selling autonomous ships technology. In our point of view, first of all, the regulation is not there. The psychology of the people is not there. The products themselves are not conceived as reliable enough to take the large commercial, I don't know, the 8,500 TEU container and take it completely autonomously with no supervision. So why should we build a product or try to change regulation that'll take years? And in any way, that's not the purpose of a startup. No startups succeeded changing regulations. This is I would say, the job of the large technology providers, the tier one of the world, the Wärtsiläs, the Kongsbergs, the ABBs of the maritime world, where they actually want to take the whole segment and digitalize that. They have the power, the resources, the time, and the air for that. As a startup, we have limited resources. We have to be hyper focused on just one thing and do that the best in the world. And this is what we decided to do in Orca. So we put the human in the loop. we took apart the situational awareness scheme of the people on board and what is required from the watchkeeper to conduct. Not even the officer of the watch, just the watchkeeper, the easiest part, I would say, of the navigational watchkeeping, looking outside, code rule 5. And we modeled that. So we had to provide, of course, the cameras because you do not have any sealed cameras designed for that in a broad SOLAS compliant field of view of at least 225 degrees from the conning position. And then we had to build on top of that the video streaming and the real-time deep learning target detection and tracking and classification and risk prioritization and range estimation and all these tasks that for us humans is, I would say, it's not even that clear in the literature of what watchkeeping is when you try to really model it into a machine. I mean, in some companies, it could be that you need to acquire targets in the ARPA. In some companies, when you have fog, you need to use the horn, fire 3 times every 5 minutes. So these tasks actually change because the world is dynamic. And this is kind of the big challenge here, the perception part, not the navigation and not following the route and not even the collision avoidance according to Colreg, but the perception. What's that? Is that a new information for me? How much time I need to be notified or to notify someone else? And this is what we've built with our own user interface and user experience to capitalize on, what the main feedback that crews tell me is that it just increases their confidence in their decisions. So they have like another system that conducts the same things that they usually do, and it corresponds to that. And
Yeah,
that's the comparative part.
I think the interesting thing you bring up is how the rules are written. And I had on about 6 months ago a 2-star admiral from the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, John Mauger, and Admiral Mauger said the toughest part about autonomous shipping or having that part in there is the rules are written for a human. And how are they written? And is it an observed thing or kind of a no? All these different, how are they written? And just those rules, the U.S. Coast Guard rules of the road, that this all of a sudden not becomes a problem, but how are you developing? The Coast Guard's going to have to start looking at all these different layers of autonomous shipping. I agree with you. I think it's going to be human in the loop. I think what it's going to allow is for the humans to do the higher executive jobs and to have a little bit of, okay, and maybe a particularly dangerous situation. When I was sailing, it was the toughest spot was in the safety fairways where you're basically going into Houston or Galveston, or we were going Houston, Galveston, we were going into Beaumont a lot. And you're going into these safety fairways basically between oil rigs. And that could get a little hairy. I don't know how it's changed in 20 years, but I remember, basically going through oil rigs and you had this lane and then the outbound traffic would come the other way. And then you had fishing boats, you had crew boats, you had pleasure craft, all kind of going in and out. And that was, like you said, that was a very dynamic situation. Oh, by the way, let's throw that in the middle of summer when you have a massive, thunderstorm pop up and you go from 10 to 15 miles of visibility to you can't see the bow of the ship in about 20 minutes. And that I could see where your technology, where any technology, but what you're talking about definitely can layer in correctly. One of the other kind of topics, of AI is we talked a little bit before, Chat GPT and all these kind of interesting and new technologies from, wearing your hat as CTO. Where do you see this kind of layering in, not just into kind of the technology, what you're doing, but into the broader maritime space? Where do you see this layering in? Will this be a major disruptor or will this be more human in loop? What do you think kind of about these, what's going on there? Because we see every day, whether it's Microsoft and Bing and all these different technologies are now adding that as extensions to Chrome. Let's say, what's your take on that, especially with the focus or an eye on our space?
So first of all, I would like to address the issue of whether or not AI is going to take our jobs and whether or not AI is going to replace us humans. And this is the first blocker always when we work with people on board and crews. Is Orca AI going to replace me someday? Is it going to take my job? What's the future holds? And I think that when you think of kind of generative AI, and I would even say more, a broad adoption of AI by the public could go both ways in our better understanding of what AI is here to do. In Orca AI, for example, where we actually have AI in our company's name, our goal is to use AI to augment and enhance the people on board, not replace them, to help them make their jobs easier, to be more attractive to younger audiences, to go and sail and work on these large commercial ships where they know they have technology that is safeguarding them. Very similar to what happened in aviation, by the way. In the past, you had 5 people to operate an airplane. Now you have 2 pilots, and that's it. Everything is automatic with almost zero involvement by the crew in cruise speed in flight. Now, what could happen the more people adopt AI and understand its limitations and its gains? It could go into both ways. One, it could be so good, so assisting, so reliable that it will really help companies like Orca AI to get a broader reach. Okay, AI, I know AI, I use ChatGPT or Chrome extension in my home. It works really good. So probably the same AI that I'll put on board is going to do good. But it could also go to the other way around. Let's say that AI is now hateful and impactful in politics, and people use it to abuse, to do wrong, then the whole perception of AI could go into the negative way, making our sale, let's call it, harder because, hey, our AI is not the same as the AI that caused the, I don't know what, the negative news that you hear all over the place and fake news and that. So if you talk about broad perspective of how AI changes our lives, this is, I think, would be really interesting and impactful in the next few years to see where it goes. Maybe some countries will ban AI without even understanding that AI for shipping is here to do good and enhance people on board and not replace them. But people tend to clinch into the common, the well-known. They always think, they presume they know things about how things operate. And this is, I think, the immediate to midterm implications of generative AI coming into our lives by storm, taking more and more things out of our lives, like schools and studies, etc.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way to look at it. I do think it'll be kind of a slow, like everything in our industry, a little bit of a slow and iterative process. I think there'll be some parts that will benefit more than others, but I do think that it's going to be viewed with a greater kind of global lens. In other words, what's going on in the greater world and how it'll impact, my decision, whether it's to purchase an AI based system or something else. I that is a very interesting point, which something what I wasn't necessarily thinking of when I answered the question how it would be answered, because I'm not a lawyer. The old adage, lawyers know the answer to the question. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just a podcast guy. One of the things that we kind of mentioned your role as chief technology officer. I've had on some folks, some admirals, Coast Guard. I've had on a lot of founders and things like that. But your role as CTO, you said you kind of met your co-founder with through your time at at the Israeli Navy. How has that kind of gone? Again, from the Navy, And a lot of people, when they go in the Navy, whether it's US or other countries, maybe they stay in maritime, but a lot of people more often than not just kind of find something in industry. How did you find your way back into maritime, which I think is kind of interesting? And then would you encourage other people, whether they have a naval background or not, to kind of get into our industry? We touched upon this a little bit before, but what is your kind of thinking about being in our space right now?
So, frankly speaking, not only I served in the Israeli Navy, but I grew up in a maritime family. Both my parents have been traveling on their catamaran yacht for the last 14 years across the globe. They sailed in the South Pacific, in South America, and Europe, and Northern Europe. And actually, it's very common for young Israeli post service to go on their, let's call it a post-service kind of trip. So my vacation post-service was sailing with my dad from Israel throughout the entire Mediterranean Sea and then crossing the North Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Bahamas for more than 6 months. And I'm actually a skipper myself, and I actually sail almost every week. Even though it's not military sailing and it's not commercial, my passion for the sea was there since I was actually a baby. And it's still until today. And I have two young, beautiful children that I always make sure that they go and try sailing with me and enjoy the sea and surfing. And the sea is a huge part of my personal life. So it's a passion of mine. One of the, I would say, the incentives for Orca AI was actually something that happened to me during my voyages with my dad, who is now 70. He is a kind of well-respected captain, master mariner. He worked for Israel Port Authority for many years. So that's in the family. And I really remember night shift next to Croatia. It's the middle of the night. He's soundly sleeping. I'm on the watch, just me and him on our sailing vessel. And I see those lights far away at the horizon. And, I really remember the battle I had inside of me. Should I wake him up or should I just ignore this and nothing's going to happen? And I check the radar and I check the chart plotter and I see these huge commercial ships just sailing straight towards us. And I actually woke him up like 5 minutes before impact. And he told me, we are really lucky he woke me up because otherwise it could really go bad. And I really remember the sheer fear of being there alone in the dark, in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, just me and a huge ship sailing towards me. And that memory kind of stayed. And this is what drives me to do Orca AI every day when I wake up. And for me, it's not a job. And so for me, the stars quite kind of aligned. People often ask me, what would you do after Orca AI? Would you like to go work in technology? And I say, I actually don't really know what I'm going to do because other things are not really of interest to me nowadays. This is what interests me the most. And it's a huge, really humble, and it's a huge, I would say, opportunity for me to lead this kind of company. And I think that if you compare me to other CTOs in tech industry, it's quite a different kind of bird that you get because it's really coming from within for me. It's not that I'm that passion towards, optimizing databases or something like that.
You said the word there that I find with a lot of my guests, and maybe it's because they're in the industry, or I'm not sure how it's correlated. Is it causation or correlation? But many guests say to me, "Well, I have this passion for the industry," and some have a familial connection like yourself. Some, like myself, just started off. The way you described that thought process of running through your brain of, do I call the captain or not, probably has described every single new third mate, myself included. I was lucky when I sailed, there was actually two third mates. And what they would do, they would put one third mate on the mid to 4 and the other third mate on the 8 to 12. And after a couple of trips, my the captains kind of relied on me as I was the one that was never afraid to call them. I was like, this could go really downhill, and waking somebody
Yeah,
up at 2 o'clock in the morning, this is
that's
their
that.
job. This is their job. I'd rather have him. We woke up now and come up and take a look and say, all right, Chris, I'm going back to bed, rather than, why is he blowing the danger whistle at 2:30 in the morning and causing that
Yeah.
angst, not only for him, but for everybody else. And that is something, as you were telling that story, it was kicking back some memories that I haven't thought about in a long time. And maybe some listeners are thinking of the same thing. So hopefully the product can help you there. As we start to wrap up, one of the questions I love to ask, and I don't know if you even have an answer for this one, and with sailing and obviously being the chief technology officer and probably heading on the road to do the presentations and maybe fundraisers and 2 kids and all that stuff. Are you reading anything interesting? Because I always like to ask that. I come up with a variety of answers from people in your situation. Say, no, I listen to audiobooks, to people who read, science fiction and fantasy. What's on the coffee table for Dor right now?
So it's really interesting question. So I actually read 2 books now. One of them is called The Endurance, the Captain Shackleton's journey to the Antarctics and Elephant Island. I'm almost finishing. It's an amazing, amazing story about heroism, and I can find a lot of familiarities with that story about the journey that I'm going through with Orca AI. So this is story number one. The book number one. The second book I'm reading is about how to gain customer traction.
There you go. Well, I think
Yeah,
that's really great. 2 books that can help you on kind of different levels. One in marketing, and of course one in with Shackleton. An interesting book, and I've mentioned it. I still got to find the name. I read part of it anyway about 10 or 12 years ago. And it just goes back to this, a lot of what Shackleton did and his navigation stuff, that hasn't really changed in years and years and years. And it reminds me of a book that I read 10 years ago where they talk about Marco Polo. And I related to, they talk in general terms about charter parties, bills of lading, and all this stuff. And that was 400, 500 years ago. So this kind of wraps up nicely. Like, our industry is changing, and you're a part of it. Companies like you're a part of it, but there's a lot of it that just isn't going to change. Navigation, safety, charter part, it's all not going to change. And it's great to hear that you guys are doing something, really interesting, and something, like you said, hopefully that could be perceived as, keeping human in the loops, making people, having that watchstander at 2 o'clock in the morning have a greater peace of mind. He or she have that greater peace of mind. It certainly sounds great, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Dor, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Christopher. It was a pleasure.
I hope that you enjoyed this discussion, learning about AI in our space and what the team at Orca AI is doing. I truly believe that AI and other technologies will not replace humans, but enable them to make more informed decisions, especially in an environment like seafaring. If you like what you heard, hit the follow button on top of the episode, and please tell a friend. Once again, I'm your host, Chris Aversano, wishing you fair winds and following seas.